Good morning, and welcome to this morning's event at the Homeland Security Policy Institute at the George Washington University. My name is Christian Beckner. I'm the Deputy Director here at the Homeland Security Policy Institute. I'd like to first start by thanking ICF, who's helping to underwrite this event and is one of our key sponsors. And then take a minute to frame a bit sort of what our discussion today is. The issue of state and local fusion centers is one that has been a key issue for the Homeland Security Policy Institute since its inception about a decade ago. It's been a key initiative since September 11th to address one of the key information sharing gaps revealed by the 9/11 Commission and in the other sort of post 9/11 analyses of some of the gaps that occurred. And I think it's been a unique initiative in the fact that it wasn't something that was mandated by the federal government as a top-down initiative. There was no presidential directive or law that ever said, we'll create this network of fusion centers. But it was really a unique bottom-up grassroots initiative undertaken by a number of states and major urban areas that eventually, after a few years, the federal government started to notice and started to realize, how can we harness this unique groundswell of activity and coalesce it around some of the national objectives that were desired with respect to counterterrorism and some of the other Homeland Security missions. We're now more than a decade out past the inception of this network of state and local fusion centers. It's evolved and matured over that time, and at HSPI we thought this was a good time to sort of assess where we are. What are the accomplishments that have been made in maturing and building this network? What are the challenges that fusion centers are going to face in the coming years, whether it's related to funding or the support of various stakeholders or their own internal operations? And what can the federal government do to better improve and enhance its relationship with fusion centers, especially given the time of budget constraints that we're facing at the federal level, but also at the state and local level today. And we'll start this event with a panel of experts and practitioners who work on these issues day to day. In the second hour of the event, we'll have Chairman Mike McCall from the House Committee on Homeland Security to come in and talk about a report that the majority staff report that they released this summer, and which I think articulated a very good and constructive set of issues for fusion centers and their federal stakeholders. But let me briefly introduce the panel that we have, and then we'll make this a sort of a moderated discussion, bring in the audience, pretty quick in terms of questions and issues that you want to raise and bring up. But so starting with my left, your right, John Cohen, who's the Principal Deputy Undersecretary at the Office of Intelligence Analysis at DHS, also the Counterterrorism Coordinator for the department. John is a good friend of HSPI and been very involved over the last decade or longer in working with working on these issues back to his time at the state of Massachusetts and in a variety of other capacities, supporting Secretary Napolitano on most of her major information sharing initiatives over the past few years. Next on the panel, Tom Kirk, who's the director of the West Virginia Intelligence Fusion Center. Following him, Ross Ashley, who's the director of the National Fusion Center Association, which coordinates the efforts of the fusion centers in terms of being their voice in Washington. And Ross is the former assistant administrator at FEMA for grants and training during the previous administration. And then finally, last in on the panel, Chris Geldart, who's the director of the Homeland Security Emergency Management Agency at DC, which is for Washington DC, which is responsible for their fusion center. So I think we'll have a good discussion for the next hour, and then hear from the chairman in terms of what he thinks. And so, I guess just to start off, I'll give you the first sort of opportunity to respond to that, John, in terms of maybe your sort of general assessment of how you see where we are in terms of the state of fusion centers. This is something that DHS has reported on and in a pretty comprehensive fashion over the past few years and build up strong assessment capability. And so I maybe just take a few minutes to sort of highlight a few key issues that you think are worth paying attention to.
Sure. Thanks, Christian, and thanks to GW for pulling this together today. This is an important and timely discussion, and let me just react a little bit to some of the things that you said. First, a key point that you made is that, and I think this is a point that is lost in Washington all too often, is that fusion centers, state and major urban area fusion centers, are not owned by the Department of Homeland Security. They're not federal entities. They were, the concept was developed at the state and local level to address very important issues at the state and local level, and that those issues pertain to how can state and local law enforcement, state and local emergency managers, public safety officials, decision makers be more information driven when making operational and programmatic decisions regarding high risk issues affecting their communities, whether it's drug trafficking issues, broader crime issues, counterterrorism issues, or homeland security issues writ large. Law enforcement and public safety at the time period in which the September 11th attacks occurred were going through an evolutionary process outside of those attacks, which focused on allowing them and leveraging resources in a more information-driven way. So the concept that state and locals would champion the establishment of analytic facilities that directly support their operational priorities shouldn't have been a surprise to anybody, though quite frankly, at the national level it was. And part of that was because at the time, immediately following the September 11th attacks, most in Washington viewed the role of state and local governments as simply response to a major incident, as opposed to prevention and protection against. So again, the fact that fusion centers may be all crimes or all hazards, not strictly focused on terrorism as their only activity from a day-to-day perspective, not only shouldn't be a surprise to anybody, but that's the way it's always been. A fusion center operates based on the environment it's located, the needs of the environment it's located in. Secondly, I think all too often, and quite frankly, I think we at the department have done this, we tend to look at fusion centers within the vacuum of the fusion center. And what I mean by that is, from a policy perspective, we see state and major urban area fusion centers as one element, a critical element, of a broader information sharing enterprise that operates in the domestic environment, which in a sense is parallel to the platform that's been established and improved upon over the last 12 years to detect threats that may originate abroad. As robust as our intelligence collection and analysis capabilities are within the intelligence community and within the defense community and even the international law enforcement community, that same platform doesn't necessarily have applicability in the domestic environment, or at least in totality. So over the last 12 years, state, local officials, intelligence community officials, law enforcement officials have struggled with what platform is best suited under the rule book that we have to operate under domestically to contribute to efforts to detect threats that may have no foreign nexus, that may originate within our local communities and be directed towards our local communities. So fusion centers are a key part of that. And the other elements of that enterprise are as follows. First, it happens at a national level, where national authorities, DHS, FBI, NCTC, other members of the IC, conduct analysis and develop products for dissemination to state and local authorities regarding national threats of concern. What are we most concerned about as far as how foreign groups or even domestic groups may be operating within this country with intentions to carry out a mass casualty or some other type of act of violence within this country? The second element of this enterprise are the fusion centers. And what they represent is a grassroots analytic capability that's able to take national intelligence and essentially put it into local context. How does this apply? How does this threat apply to my area of responsibility? What would this threat look like if it were to be evolving within my area of responsibility? What are the vulnerabilities within my area of responsibility that contribute to the risk faced by my area of responsibility? We are looking for fusion centers, which again first and foremost, carry out local responsibilities to contribute to this national enterprise by conducting that type of analysis and disseminating information to organizations within their area of responsibility that help them be better organized and better able to better able to recognize emerging threats within their area of responsibility. The third area of this enterprise has to do with standardizing how we train state and local law enforcement, the general public, to recognize behaviors and indicators associated with specific threats or terrorism-related criminal activity more broadly. Through the Nationwide Suspicious Activity Reporting Initiative, through the training that we do, through the dissemination that Fusion Centers conduct, we are looking to actively raise the awareness level of state and local law enforcement specifically, so that when suspicious circumstances or suspicious activity reports are provided to them, they can very rapidly not only recognize those suspicious activities for being associated with a threat or terrorism, but also know where that information needs to go, whether to be further analyzed or investigated through the actions, say, of a joint terrorism task force. And the fourth element of this enterprise is the public. Through campaigns like If You See Something, Say Something, through the work that the FBI does and our infrastructure protection folks do with the private sector to establish tripwires. The idea is that you are building awareness at the very basic grassroots level. So if people observe suspicious activities, if they see things that they think may be related to a threat, not only are they recognizing it, but they're reporting it. And of course, the role of Fusion Center, just one other role I want to emphasize is it's not just about taking national intelligence and putting it into local context, but it's looking at local reporting and looking at it from the view or within the context of the national intelligence that's been provided. Fusion Centers are in a unique position to look at suspicious activity reports because they have both an in-depth understanding of the local environment, but they also have visibility. It needs to get better, but a growing level of visibility into issues of national concern, and that's what makes them unique. So that's just sort of my initial reaction to what you said, and I look forward to answering any questions.
I guess, building off of that, I'd ask our local, state and local representatives to respond and talk about sort of, for a minute, sort of what the value proposition is for Fusion Centers from that state perspective, from that local perspective, in light of what John just talked about, and then maybe, if you could provide an anecdote or example of sort of how that value proposition gets sort of realized in your, day-to-day operations.
Okay, thank you. Good morning. Like Deputy Cohn said, I wanted to also thank HSPI for inviting someone from West Virginia here. Didn't take me too long to find my way. I have just a brief history of the West Virginia Intelligence Fusion Center. We're 5.5 years old. A couple years ago, I used to blame a lot of mistakes we made because we were so new, but as fusion centers go, we're about right in the middle of maturity. Most fusion centers are about right where we're at, so I can't use that excuse anymore. But we've been able to come a long way. We are we're not ran by the state police. My background is state police, but we operate directly under the Cabinet Secretary of Military Affairs Public Safety. We are totally independent of any of the other agencies. We report directly to him and to the Homeland Security Advisor for West Virginia. And I also want to reflect what Deputy Cohn said about the fact that it's a local environment. And I have, again, my background is law enforcement. I've been in some degree of law enforcement almost 35 years. I have never seen a network the way that we have a network now. We had an incident 2 weeks ago where I received a call from the governor's office and said, we have a situation where we received an email from someone that is threatening all of a state office in West Virginia, but it's a statewide office. There are offices throughout the entire state. As a very general threat, but at the same time, we have to take these seriously. We don't know what to do with it. Give us some insight. And what I was allowed to do was I was allowed to put out an email to every fusion center, 78 fusion centers, and explain the situation. And within a matter of minutes, I began to receive responses back. And within an hour, out of the 78 fusion centers, I have received over 60 responses from all over the nation, from Alaska, California, Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, stating that we have not received anything like that. In fact, they went into a lot more detail. They not only said we have not received, but we have contacted our companion state agency of the one that you have in West Virginia. They state that they've not received any kind of threat like that. They will keep their eyes open. If we do receive something, we will notify you immediately. So I was able to, within an hour, brief my governor on this is a local issue. This is not a 9/11 type incident. This is something where someone has a problem with West Virginia. What that allowed us to do within our fusion center, one of the agencies that we have is we have our Office of Technology Forensic Division located within our fusion center. So we were immediately able to basically swivel our chair and hand them the information we had and see how, ask them how far they could trace that down. At the same time, we have our Joint Terrorism Task Force, we have state police, all located within our fusion center. So everyone kind of split and began to do their own thing. But the fact that I was able, again, within a matter of a very short time limit, to search the entire nation and find out that this was centric to West Virginia really helped us concentrate our efforts. It put everybody else on notice that there might be something out there. If there is in your state, please let us know. But it really gave us the ability to concentrate all of our efforts right there in West Virginia. And again, in all law enforcement, I've never seen anything like that. I've worked organized crime, murder cases. I've worked up and down the East Coast on a lot of organized crime cases in my career. And it was always a kind of a crapshoot when you picked up the telephone to talk to someone, how much interest they were going to take in your case, who it was you were talking to, whether they would actually get back to you. And with this network, that's not an issue. Most of the time when I call another fusion center director, they know my voice because we meet, we talk on a regular basis. So, and there's many examples. I don't want to take up too much of the panel's time. I can just tell you that it works. It really works, and it's something like I've never seen before. We're really proud of our center. We're proud of the network, and we see nothing but good things to happen as far as intelligent-led policing, or again, not reactive as much as being proactive on crime and terrorism.
So Tom is being a little modest on this because on this incident, let me just give a couple other details without getting too detailed. While they were running down that threat from the morning, later that day, there was a shooting outside of a federal courthouse in the same state, which got a lot of attention in Washington. People were very concerned because there were some folks that had seen a little bit of the information from the morning, and then having an active shooter type situation outside of a federal government facility within a time window that just was causing a lot of concern. But because of the work that their fusion center had already done, because of the coordination that was taking place within that fusion center, they're not necessarily running the operation, but the situational awareness that they were able to provide national organizations because of the work that they had been doing all throughout the day was incredibly valuable as we were trying to assess whether we had a major extremist type active shooter situation going on, or whether it was a coincidence or what the true story was. So the dynamics that he talked about within his own state, which is replicated across the country, and we see these types of experiences literally on a weekly basis. That is really what the goal was in working with state and local authorities to support these centers. And the goal is actually being actualized and operationalized on a day-to-day basis.
Chris, do you want to jump in?
Good morning, everybody. The first thing I'd like to say is to thank George Washington University, HSPI, and ICF for bringing us all together to talk about this, get these perspectives out here. So thank you to all of them. Secondly, I'd like to welcome back all our federal employees. As yesterday was the first full commute day, I'm reminded of just how many federal employees we have that work here. So thank you to all of you. You know, a lot of stuff was talked about so far about the fusion centers and the federal perspective from DHS on the need and necessity and goal of the fusion centers, and that's all very important to us. A little bit on the state level, a little bit on my background. I was actually a Deputy Director of Homeland Security of the state of Maryland some years ago, and helped establish the Maryland Coordination Analysis Center in 2004. And then coming into the job here in DC and inheriting the fusion center that Kathy Lanier, the Chief of Police, had been shepherding along. And I can tell you that the view of sharing the national intelligence information and feeding that process for threats and hazards that are around is very important. But as a local government, as a major municipality, and a state at times, we act as all here in the district. The value proposition of a fusion center goes beyond just that. And for us, and the way we've reorganized our fusion center, and Tip White, who's our fusion center director, is sitting up here in the front row. The way we've organized our fusion center really gets the value proposition for a city, which goes beyond just those national level suspicious activity reporting and things that is, once again, very important. But when you're talking to a mayor about why do we have this center and why are we spending this kind of money on this effort, it's got to go beyond just the terrorism aspect and just the sharing of information back and forth between the federal government and the local or state governments. Hence, the way we set ours up is looking at truly the all hazards aspect of this. We look at everything from cybersecurity to critical infrastructure protection. Many of the things that were mentioned earlier are huge contributors to that. But then also the intelligence-led policing that was mentioned earlier, that's a huge component. But then also doing those strategic products and doing those day in and day out investigation, intelligent information sharing jobs of helping the health department understand what's going on with this new form of cholera or the different diseases and outbreaks that are going on, and where are they in the country, and how is that affecting the district here? You know, because that leads to a public health emergency potentially. So also looking at issues in the emergency management field. There's so many things that the Fusion Center can do in the way they're trained and the analytic ability that they bring that greatly enhances all of our operational entities. What you'll find in many places where these fusion centers exist and thrive, there's a good, I'll call it a governance board or advisory board or some kind of overarching body that consists of folks from across the disciplines. On our advisory board, we have our chief technology officer, we have our health officer, our fire chief, our police chief, myself from emergency management and homeland security, and our Office of Unified Communications, our 911 and 311 centers. That group really are the ones that benefit when you're talking about a value proposition from an analytic capability that can be vested in a major metropolitan area or in a state level. And feeding those constituents with timely, accurate, and useful information, whether it's gained from open source reporting or other means, is pivotal for us in doing our job and making sure that we're looking at all things we need to be looking at across the state. The other thing I would say is the operational nature of the fusion centers is also an ongoing change that's going on. We have things like the Boston Marathon, the Navy Yard here in the district, and what's the role of the fusion center as it goes operational, as the city goes operational and is dealing with things like that. How do they assist in multiple areas of incident command or unified command? FEMA just came out with their NIMS guidance for intelligence and information sharing. I think yesterday it came out. You know, this is the type of thing, that value proposition of that fusion center goes beyond just the sharing of suspicious activity reporting, the training of folks to see something and say something. Those are all real important aspects and are the core foundations of why we have fusion centers. But you really got to have that value proposition to sell a city or a locality and maintaining this type of effort.
Thanks. In terms of that value proposition, one of the issues that Chairman McCall and former Chairman King raised in their report is that issue of sort of, how you quantify the value proposition. How do you, show the bang for your buck, to your stakeholders? I think that was that's been one of these challenges, in part because of the nature of the work that fusion centers do. A lot of it focuses on prevention and deterrence. So you don't necessarily know it's the dog that didn't bark in a lot of cases that is the work you've done. But Ross, if you want to jump in on this, and John, feel free to jump in later too. But what's your sort of assessment of where what's being done to sort of improve that assessment of performance and for the key stakeholders, not just at the federal level, but in state legislatures and among the general public as well?
First, I want to say a couple of things about these guys that they didn't tell you. Tom Kirk says his background is in law enforcement. He's actually the former superintendent of the West Virginia State Police, so he's not just a former law enforcement guy. And of course, we are lucky to have John Cohen where he is today. He's also he's a former narcotics officer. He's been on the street. So these are folks that have been in positions at state and local levels that are now kind of guiding national policy, which is always pleasant to have, especially in this world. Let me start with an expression that you hear a little bit when you hear about fusion centers. You hear this expression: if you've seen one fusion center, you've seen one fusion center. And that's a true statement. And I would like you to think of that as a positive statement, not a negative statement. And the reason is that John mentioned it earlier, the primary customer base for the fusion center are the state or major urban area governments, those leaders that are making decisions in the communities every day. So they organize themselves differently in every jurisdiction around the country. As Tom mentioned, he works directly with the Cabinet Secretary as an independent agency. We have folks that report up through the Homeland Security Advisor and Emergency Manager. We have folks that report up to the Superintendent of the State Police. Everywhere is different because the needs of the local jurisdiction or state are different, okay? So that's an actual very important thing. But what you will find through that difference is a set of core capabilities. And that's what DHS kind of is the guiding principle, if you will, that goes through every fusion center. There's a set of core capabilities that every fusion center is assessed on annually. And that's very important of that value proposition, but it's only part of it. I'll give you a couple expressions, and I'll use Colonel Rick Fuentes in New Jersey as the superintendent up there as an example. He is constantly asked by local governments. There's 1,800 government agencies inside of New Jersey. It's a weird state. But constantly asked to have troopers put in these jurisdictions to help combat crime. We only have so many troopers. So he's come up with this creative approach of saying, I cannot put more troopers on the Route 21 corridor between Camden and Newark, where most of the violent crime happens in New Jersey. But what I can give you is this resource I have, this analytic resource to all these local chiefs to say, let me help you help yourselves, right? To do intelligence-led policing, okay? So we're finding more and more that fusion centers are becoming successful in two different areas. One in standard intelligence information-led policing, and maturing that level of what's going on in law enforcement here in the country today. So we're kind of a victim of success on that side. We're also a victim of success on the other side in that in our federal kind of interaction with the federal government, it used to be just in counterterrorism. It used to just be, that was the focus. Now we find that we're working border issues, we're working immigration issues, we're working TSA issues, we're working FEMA issues, right? You talk to the New Jersey Fusion Center about what they did during Hurricane Sandy. Talk to the whole Southeast about what they do now in Southern Shield and that whole response to hurricanes in there, and information-led public safety and emergency management. So what's going to be interesting, I think, is what Congressman McCall is going to come up and talk about. Is one of the recommendations that they have is there's this issue of what is this national priority inside of a fusion center. And that's where we're kind of struggling at this point, is looking for, I'll give you a good example. 60 Minutes wanted to do a story on fusion centers that John and I were intimately aware of, and that's never a good thing when 60 Minutes wants to do a story on you. So I spent about 2 months with 2 60 Minutes producers traveling around the country and basically sucking up to these guys as much as I possibly could, educating them on fusion centers. And so here you're taking people that don't know anything about fusion centers and bringing them through a process of learning. And when I dropped off the producer right before they decided they weren't going to do the report, and I was relieved, he said a couple things to me. He said, one, if you go out on the street, and I challenge anybody to go out there, even in Washington, D.C., and find 10 people and ask them what a fusion center is, I doubt you'll find one that knows. And that's a problem, okay? The other thing is that he said, I get it that these things should exist, and I get it that my tax dollars ought to pay for them. I expect this to happen in my community. This is why I have public safety and homeland security. He says, what I don't get is that how much of it should be from my state and local tax dollars and how much of it should be from my federal tax dollars. And that's where we struggle today. And what is that federal nexus? I used to tell people I carried around the Constitution with me all the time. Now I've got an app for it, right? Everybody's got an app for it. But it does say provide for the common defense in the first line. It says promote general welfare, but it says provide. And the former Homeland Security advisor from the state of Alabama says, well, that makes this a federal responsibility, right? Because here's the biggest challenge, the metric piece. You can't do the federal terrorism stuff without doing the public safety side. There's not a magic piece of terrorism information out there that you can go pick it out and say, that's it, let me go transfer this to DHS and problem solved. You have to look at the whole domain. You have to look at the driver's license information. You have to look at LPR issue. You have to look at suspicious activity reports. You have to look at all of this information and combine it together to find out if there is a nexus, okay? That's kind of the main purpose that the fusion centers have. Now, what has happened since the inception of fusion centers is that a couple different things. Tom mentioned this horizontal sharing. That's relatively a new event in the last couple years. And that is a large part been supported by most of the federal agencies here. You know, we've got a lot of great partners here in DC, from PMISC to DHS, FBI, and the DNI's office. Believe it or not, we actually work with the Director of National Intelligence Office in facilitating that horizontal sharing, which has become very important. And I'm going to end with one last thing, and what Vernon Keenan says when we talk. And Vernon's from the state of Georgia, and what he says, the director of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, and he says, if the federal funding were to go away tomorrow, my fusion center will still be here. We can't afford not to have it. The local jurisdictions rely on it now. Again, that victim of success. But what will go away is that national coordination, that national nexus, that ability to be able to look across fusion centers, to pass information back and forth, and we'll lose that connection. So as we look at metrics, DHS, if you look at what they do with their critical operational capabilities, assesses a very narrow aspect of what a fusion center does. But it's the aspect that is important to the federal government. And what I think gets lost is when people see that sliver, they don't see the totality of everything else that's going on. And that's where I think a little bit gets lost in the shuffle there. So let me end one last thing, where we're going, all right? The idea of analysis inside of fusion centers has been around since the beginning. But rapidly, we're finding with this horizontal sharing, we'll find an expert in Washington State on international human trafficking over international ferry systems. Well, I don't need that expert everywhere. What I need is the ability to reach out to that expert if I'm in West Virginia and share analysis, share tradecraft. So we're getting beyond the point here, and a lot of this is being helped out through PMISC, through Shemender's office, is instead of just sharing information, if you remember from third grade math when you come up with an answer, but your teacher would say, show me the work. This is about show me the work. Let me take that tradecraft from that expert in Washington State and run it on my own data. Let's get beyond just sharing data to sharing the methods by which we come up with answers, right? So that makes the network exponentially that much more powerful. So that's where we see ourselves going. So anyway, I'll end with that.
John, did you want to say anything?
Ross made a couple key points, and I just want to sort of emphasize them a little bit in a very disjointed way. I mean, most of us up here have been local cops, and I think it's important that when you look at fusion centers, you need to look at them not just from the perspective of how the federal government deals with problems, but how state and local law enforcement or state and local governments deal with problems. Counterterrorism, as a specific issue, is not something that local law enforcement deals with outside of the construct of how they deal with day-to-day crime. It's integrated into it. So as you have police officers working with community members to identify and mitigate emerging risks within a community, it's within that construct in which local authorities deal with counterterrorism. We have, for decades, dealt with major issues of national import, whether it's transnational drug trafficking or human smuggling or other types of issues that are important to the federal government, but also have implications from a state and local perspective. But we've dealt with them through the development of multi-jurisdictional task forces, plus very basic local law enforcement activities that are designed to prevent violence in our communities. So when you're evaluating the value added of a fusion center, to simply look at it from the perspective of the federal government's approach to dealing with problems gives you what I would, in this setting at least, describe as a very flawed perspective of the value proposition of that analytics center. As Ross said, you have to look at it within the context of the value added that analytics center is not only providing local jurisdictions, but providing local jurisdictions by enabling them to incorporate into their day-to-day service delivery model activities that are intended toward preventing violence from occurring within a local community. Just to expand on that a little bit, I think one of my responsibilities at the department has been both to lead our CVE efforts, our countering violent extremism efforts, and the efforts of the department dealing with mass casualty active shooter events. And we have done, in both of those efforts, which started off as two separate efforts, done quite a bit of analysis of mass casualty attacks that have occurred within local communities, whether the target's been a school, a government building, a movie theater, a Navy yard. What's interesting from that, and it really is causing a shift in thinking at the national level, where mass casualty attacks seem to be categorized and prioritized based on the motive of the offender. But when you look at that same dynamic from a state and local perspective, motive is interesting. It's a key part of your prosecutorial strategy, but from the standpoint of prevention and response, motive is not all that important. State and local authorities have a responsibility to prevent mass casualty acts of violence in our communities, regardless of the motivation of the offender. And quite frankly, we'll use, in general, the same strategies, whether the individual preparing to carry out an attack is motivated by a workplace grievance or an ideological grievance. So through the work with fusion centers, what we are seeking to do is to examine these past acts of mass casualty attacks, look at them from the perspective of how a state and local would look at it versus how perhaps a federal authority would traditionally look at this, and identify behaviors and indicators regardless of the motive of the attacker. So fusion centers, if you're trying to examine the value proposition of fusion centers, I would actually also argue you need to look at the way that fusion centers and the interaction with state and local governments through the fusion centers is changing the way federal authorities think about solving problems within our local communities, where you're beginning to see a broadening, in a sense, of the way members of the intelligence community, the federal law enforcement community, the federal emergency management community are viewing problems affecting communities across our country. And as we enter into, as you alluded to earlier, these increasingly challenging budgetary times, figuring out how to incorporate some of these national responsibilities in the day-to-day service delivery is going to continue to be where we focus our attention. And I think that's one of the ways you need to, when you're evaluating the value added that comes from these interactions, you need to factor that in as well.
Christian, I just want to add one quick thing that none of us mentioned and we should have is the notion that every fusion center has an federally approved DHS and FBI privacy policy, right? So if you think about this from a civil rights, civil liberties kind of issue, right, let's put a different hat on here for a second. Having these powerful analytic entities that can look through and mine through all this information is not all appreciated by everyone, okay? And it has to be done in an extremely responsible way. And one of the things I think Fusion Centers does is it pulls this information, it pulls the people together, and it holds them accountable under a policy. Are they going to make mistakes? Yes. But the good news about that is you'll know where the mistake is made, and you can correct the mistake. Vice, if we were trying to do this out there with 18,000 some odd law enforcement agencies without any kind of common set of standards of how to do it, we'd probably be in a worse situation than we are by putting them together and training the people the right way to do it.
I'll ask a final question, then we'll open it up to the audience for questions. But one of the the questions that you frequently hear asked about fusion centers is, do we really need 78 or 79? I forget where we are even in last count. Fusion centers, and you've seen that in a lot of the sort of public rhetoric on fusion centers. I think it's a bit of a flawed question, because they are bottom up, locally run, locally created initiatives. But it does, I think, lead to a question that is legitimate, is that, the federal government, with its limited resources in terms of grant dollars, in terms of personnel, in terms of the ability to deploy teams for training, how should it, allocate its limited resources, both DHS, FBI, other federal partners? Should it, focus on the centers that are already strong and mature and functioning? Should it, versus trying to bring up some of the newer, centers that are sort of on the lower scale of the maturation curve? And and I think that's if there were unlimited resources, that wouldn't be as much of a challenge. But I'd like any of you to sort of jump in on that, and how do we sort of address that that issue of building the network and prioritizing resources within a budget constrained environment?
So I'll hit on that. And Ross mentioned earlier the network and the ability to reach out to other jurisdictions that may have unique capabilities and share not only the products of that, but also the methods in which it's used. And that's very important. But I'll put this into a real operational context. When we were running the Navy Yard and we were in the middle of the response to the Navy Yard, a lot of information is coming out from the scene, and a lot of misinformation is coming out from the scene. And one of the things, and I'll let Tip talk to any particulars on this if he wants to, but one of the things Tip was able to do with our Fusion Center was very quickly get out to the network. Here's what we know. Here's what we think. Does anybody have any additional information? And there were reports of the person involved in this being involved in other incidents in other places, and we were very rapidly able to chase that down and find the true facts from those areas across the country where our potential cause or person responsible had been, and enabled us to really focus in very quickly on exactly what we had. And if we didn't have that outreach to the other fusion centers and that proactive feedback from them, because we didn't go out and say, hey, we heard maybe something's happening in Colorado or LA, they called us once we put the information out on the network. And they called us back and they said, here's what we have and what we know for fact that's been done. So that network and that ability to get that information shared that quickly would never happen if we didn't have this network in place.
I'll just say one thing about it. About how many there should be, it's market driven, right? And there are more fusion centers than 78 fusion centers that are recognized out there. There's a Northeast Florida Fusion Center in Jacksonville. There's not one of the, but they exist and do the same thing. So it's a market-driven thing. Now, that's from the state perspective, because that's in the local perspective, because that's how they were founded, right? If there is a need, they will create one. And that need will be a state and or local need. What DHS has done, and John can speak to it probably more eloquently than I can, is derived a set of what's called a resource allocation criteria, which looks at it from the federal perspective and says, I can afford to do X. Well, my first priority are my primary fusion centers. The one the governor says, this is my main one, right? Or the mayor says is the main one. Then there are designated fusion centers that coordinate with the primary fusion center. Those will be your urban area ones where you may have San Francisco, which is a big major urban area that has the Northern California Regional Intelligence Center, but then you also have the State Fusion Center in Sacramento. So that becomes the second level. Then the third level is, what do you call it, the major major city the major crime, real-time criminal intelligence centers is the third one. So as you go through the allocation of dollars, people, and resources, networks, and other things that DHS has put into the equation, and other federal partners, FBI net, et cetera, how many different connections that they can put out there, they go through that resource allocation criteria. Say, this is the let's do these 50 first, plus a couple of the territories. Then let's get to the others and kind of go through that as they allocate the dollars. John, do you want to elaborate?
Yeah, I
on
mean,
that?
I think there's, as with as all too often occurs, there's sort of a conflating of two separate issues. There was a plan back in 2006, 2007, when the last real strategy that talked about how these state and locally owned intelligence facilities fit into a national enterprise. The idea was that there needed to be a dialogue, there needed to be a discussion at the state and local level between governor's offices, major urban areas, and others to figure out how they can best share information across their state or their UASI region. And what was envisioned is that, through a planning process, basically state and local governments within a specific state would come to a conclusion of what's the most effective way to support the needs of the state. And whether California, feels that their needs can be best addressed through multiple fusion centers, and other states can feel that their needs can be best addressed through a local center, that really is a discussion and a decision that needed to be made by state and local governments. And so that's why I think you see variance across different states. They have had these discussions and they've come to those conclusions. So when I get asked on the Hill, well, is 78 enough, or should there be 83 or 63? That's not for me to say. What is for me to say is where we invest our resources. And so we have a process in place that Ross alluded to, where based on our assessment of priorities from a Homeland Security perspective, based on our understanding of the risk and threat environment, the threat and risk environment, we make a determination where to invest our resources, people, connectivity to classified and unclassified systems, and the other things that we do outside of the grant process to support operationally the activities of a fusion center. Now, I've been in this new job as principal deputy of INA for a couple weeks now, and I can already tell you that one of my priorities will be to increase the number of analytic personnel that we put out in fusion centers. I think it's important. We have mainly intelligence officers right now. They in a sense are ombudsmen for DHS, and they provide broad support to fusion centers. But one of the areas where I'd like to see the department engage more actively with fusion centers is in integrated and joint analytic activities. And you do that by putting more analytic resources in the field and working together with the analysts in the fusion centers. But again, we do have a process for figuring out, based on our limited resource base, where the best investment is. But I also get asked, well, wait a minute, if you're not going to say how many fusion centers there should be, then should all of them be able to use grant funds? Again, how state or urban areas use their grant funds is their decision. But from my perspective, because we tie certain performance metrics and operational standards to the grant process, I hope they use grant funds to fund every recognized fusion center. And the reason for that is, and Ross again alluded to it, one of our core operational capabilities has to do with privacy and civil liberties protections. And the way that we enforce those key operational capabilities is by tying them to the utilization of grant funds. So if you want to use your grant funds to fund your recognized fusion center, great. However, you have to be able to do certain things. And one of those things are you have to have established and a mechanism to implement key privacy and civil liberties protections.
Thanks. And Tip, if you wanted to come up and speak first, if you want to go.
Thanks. I might be able to provide an additional perspective on that in terms of, you talk about, and Director Geldart mentioned the broad national network, but the real key for us, especially during the Navy Yard, is the personal relationships at the local level. And we talk about in a networked society. In theory, could I support, say, Puerto Rico? Could we provide, analytic products for Puerto Rico? Well, in theory, yes. But what is important to Puerto Rico or to Guam? You have to know the local leadership there and know what their concerns are and spend time with them and develop that personal relationship so that For example, in the case of the Navy Yard, Chief Lanier personally picked up the phone and called me and provided me with the number of the lead detective on scene that actually took my call at the height of the activities there to determine if it was the man that we were looking for with the tan short sleeve shirts that we had accounted for, or if it was the person in the olive drab uniform we were still looking for. Because there was, as you can imagine, there was a lot of confusion out on the network of, gosh, we're looking for these two people. We found one of them. Which one is it? And one person heard this one, and I was able to reach out in the middle of the action and have that person, who is obviously very busy and actually, in range of bullets flying, to be able to take my phone call because he knew who I was, and to tell me, no, definitely, we have accounted for the man in the tan shirt. We're looking for the olive drab. And then I could put that information out to the national network and all of the local law enforcement agencies and everyone that's supporting that we have that network, and be sure that it's accurate, vetted information, and we don't have the situation in Boston where oh, we have people in custody. Wait, no, we don't. Wait, we're looking for this person. No, we're not. And that value, because of the personal relationships, is something that can't be understated. And while I could develop that with about 500 trips back and forth to Puerto Rico, the network only goes so far in terms of that personal relationship. And so you need to build that personal relationship and interface with your local leaders on a frequent and continual basis to know what's important on their minds, so then you can tailor the products that your center produces to their needs. And that goes to the value proposition. If they are getting what they need, they perceive value and see the institution as being worthwhile. And for example, I know that Chief Lanier is very concerned about iPhone thefts because of the potential for violence and robbery. I know Director Geldart's concern is emergency management and how we're going to react to another large-scale storm or other kind of mass disaster. And I can go on with each of our key stakeholders for what's on the top of their minds, and that's only based on that local interaction.
Thanks.
Could I just throw one last thing on there very quickly? Mr. Cohen talks a lot about the federal funding that goes into this, and that's a key aspect. I will tell you that the federal funding pays for our analysts, and we've gotten very, at the city level, we've become very good at making sure we can leverage that funding, and it pays for just about 13 folks in our Fusion Center, and it's probably stretched that money to its extent. However, that's not what makes our Fusion Center necessarily run. It's a big part of it. It's a huge part of it. But what really makes it run, that network that Tip is talking about, starts local, where we have, because we've been able to build that capability with those funding and having DHS in with us with their analysts, that attracts our local constituents. So we have liaison officers in there that are engaged with us from, you name the federal agency. Everywhere from Amtrak police here in the city to Park Police to the university consortiums that are here to the hospital associations that are here. When you start to build that nexus and you start to you fund it at the base level from a federal perspective, that metastasizes itself into people saying, this is something I need to be connected with. So that base funding, let me tell you, it doesn't pay for your fusion. It pays for your base analysts, and that's what you get. And then if you build that right, then you get the engagement of that community and the people to come in and actually participate.
Yeah, a couple, just to reemphasize, more than half the money that's spent across the country to fund Fusion Center operations is not federal funding.
Right.
Most of the funding is state and local funding. Secondly, what was just described, when I'm wearing my counterterrorism coordinator hat and an event is occurring in a city across the country, from my national role perspective, I need non-media information about what's going on in the ground. And I need to be able to assess whether this is an isolated incident, whether it's terrorism related, whether it is an incident that may impact other jurisdictions. Do we have to move DHS operational assets to support? And so the relationships that's built through the Fusion Center, which is one of my primary reach out points, touch points, to get that ground truth, is invaluable. Now, I don't know how you measure that from a performance metric perspective, but I can tell you from the standpoint of having situational awareness about an emerging event and having to go brief the secretary, talk to the component heads at DHS to figure out whether we need to move Coast Guard assets, ICE assets, CBP assets, whether we needed to close down additional federal buildings, whether we need to start doing things in other cities. It's the information that's coming out in essentially real time based on the relationships that are built within the Fusion Center environment that is more valuable to me than almost any other mechanism for gaining that type of situational awareness information.
Thanks. We have a few minutes for questions from the audience. I think we'll take 2 or 3 questions and then, in a row, and then before people respond. And so if there's a mic coming around, please identify yourself. You can come up here. It's coming.
John Pichkowski. I manage the Homeland Security practice at ICF International, and we support the state and local program office at INA. A question that's of interest to me is it's been very gratifying to watch the maturity of the state and local Fusion Center program. I mean, a tremendous number of very talented people have built that program, and Deputy Cohen, your appointment, I think, speaks volumes about the administration's focus on this, and I think you're saying all the right things, and I can see Ross nodding all the time when you speak, so I don't know if he has his hand up your back or not, but certainly you've been there and done that, so I think you appreciate what these folks go through and the importance of the dual mission. In that regard, I think as I watch the maturity of state and local fusion centers, there's some things that I think still can be done at the federal level to help with the better integration of national level programs with the information sharing environment and state and local fusion centers that we haven't yet fully capitalized on. One is in the area of infrastructure protection. And I do work with the Naval Postgraduate School where we work with governors and their Homeland Security staffs. They often bring their fusion center directors there appropriately. And as we talk about critical infrastructure protection, there are some that don't quite fully understand the nature of infrastructure interdependencies. They're more keyed in on the investigatory aspects of fusion center operations and the analytics than they are necessarily in the context as much as they might know about their state. And one of the core capabilities that were identified several years ago, and I helped to develop them, was to assist Fusion Center analysts with better understanding critical infrastructure protection, the implications of interdependencies and the vulnerabilities, because then they would understand 2 sides of the equation. One, the bad guy, and of course, what the bad guy may try to do. And in those jurisdictions where they have that understanding, like has been described, like in New Jersey, I think that they're able to provide a tremendous amount of value add to even things like disaster response and recovery because they understand the infrastructure so well. More importantly, they're an asset, I think, that can inform the governors as they consider risks across the state and the allocation of state resources, or a major metropolitan area is considering, do I spend money on violent crime and gangs or do I invest in my fusion center? So the first part of that question is, how do you see that maturation relative to critical infrastructure protection and IP and the issuance of the National Infrastructure Protection Plan that's in rewrite right now? The other is there are programs like the Domestic Nuclear Detection Office, for example, where a tremendous part of the nuclear detection architecture rests on intelligence information sharing. My observation is that fusion centers are not yet as fully plugged in to that environment as possible. So as you look across the milieu of DHS agencies and the interaction that they have, whether it's Customs and Border Protection, DNDO, or IP, what do you think that DHS can do to better integrate those efforts with your own and INA and advance the importance of state and local fusion centers?
So you hit on a lot of key issues, and I'll try to hit them really quick without keeping everybody here or delaying Chairman McCall's speech. No, you're absolutely right. And whether I look at this from the perspective of INA or from the fusion centers, simply replicating threat-related analysis that takes place in other places across the federal community. I don't see that as being the sweet spot either for INA nor the fusion centers. However, when you blend together critical infrastructure, vulnerability information, consequence information, threat information, police reporting, you're integrating those data sources together to look at holistically at risk evolution within a community. That is an analytic niche that I think both INA and DHS more broadly, but at a grassroots level, the fusion centers really can fill that brings tremendous value. I can't get into the specifics of it, but there was a situation last year that I think is illustrative of exactly what you're describing. Specific threat, foreign organization. We tied the threat to a discrete number of cities across the country and a discrete type of infrastructure. We, in a sense, not in a sense, we worked with the fusion centers, we worked with local police, we worked with infrastructure protection to not only identify potential vulnerabilities and security measures that could be put in place to mitigate those vulnerabilities, but we then leveraged data in the SAR repositories, the NSI repositories, to develop an analytic baseline of suspicious activity reporting around that critical infrastructure, and then we monitored it. And we monitored it for the purposes of identifying any blips that might be indicative of pre-operational activities associated with those critical infrastructure. That's a type of analysis that can't be done in Washington necessarily, because we don't, to the point that was made earlier, we don't have that local knowledge, and it would be very difficult for us to amass the granular, that knowledge at the granular level of detail that's needed in order to both understand the risk environment, but also monitor events occurring around that critical infrastructure. A second, I think one of the areas that you didn't mention, but I think bears mentioning, is as far as these emerging type areas, is cyber. And I see that as an area where fusion centers will continue to play an increasing role from the analytic perspective. At the state and local level, there's 3 areas where cyber becomes extraordinarily important. More and more, traditional criminal activity has a cyber element to it, whether it's an extortion or theft. More and more of this is occurring in the cyber environment, in the internet environment, and local law enforcement, state law enforcement are having to become much more sophisticated in conducting those types of investigations. That requires analytic support. The second area that we're concerned about is we're seeing an integration of cyber intrusion techniques and other activity and physical threats. In the past, in days of old, cybercrime was handled by the IT office, and threats to physical infrastructure was handled by some different security-related organization. We're now seeing people who want to inflict physical damage to our critical infrastructure or targeting specific organizations, leveraging network intrusion techniques and other activities to amass information and conduct pre-operational surveillance. That is an area where I think you're going to see more activity from the fusion center environment. And then finally, understanding that state and local governments are being targeted as the victims, to be the victims of cyber-related attacks. Ask any police chief who has had a denial of service attack against his PSAP, whether it's important or not to have a capacity to deal with these types of issues. That requires some back-end analysis as well, but it's a bringing together of communities that aren't necessarily the traditional communities that would interact with each other from a threat analysis perspective.
Any other questions in the back there?
Thanks, John Mueller from Ohio State. You talked a lot about process, could you talk a little bit about results, particularly within the terrorism area? How much have the fusion centers contributed to stopping terrorism or to terrorism arrests or apprehensions or disruptions?
There's one key person I'd love to have on this panel, and you could probably look up, there's an article he published. This guy's name's Jim Davis. He was the SAC in Colorado during the Zazi investigation. He's now the Commissioner of Public Safety, I believe, for the state of Colorado. And he's talked often about the Zazi case and the role of the CAIAC out there, the Colorado Fusion Center, in its role in investigative support to that case. The FBI and our Joint Terrorism Task Forces have the primary operational responsibility for finding, prosecuting terrorist cases. Fusion centers, think of them as analytic support, the ground truth. What is, the FBI has limited resources, so the fusion center is being able to provide those investigative support resources there in the analytic support. So I'll just point you towards that one. And John, if you want to mention anything more recent, one more. 2 days after the takedown of the bin Laden facility, there was information that was flowing from special operators on the ground halfway across the world and mayors and governors were being briefed about a specific threat that took place. Now, I grew up in that community on the military side, and during Panama and all of that, never before would any of that have happened. So when you talk about specific threats moving from shooter to our special operator to governors and mayors about specific threats, that's an incredible capability that's out there today that never was before. And going to Tom's example of negating information, the amount of money that is saved on negating information is amazing. And I know we've got limited time here, so I will...
I'll just add, there's multiple examples where the analytic activities of a fusion center have contributed to disruption of attacks. There's an example in the Pacific Northwest where individual contacted a local police detective because of the initial analysis analytic support provided by the fusion center. They were able to connect what appeared initially just to be a gun acquisition case to actually a plot to carry out an attack against a DoD facility. There was an event not too long ago, several months ago, where an individual reported information to a Texas police department. That Texas police department developed a suspicious activity report based on the report. The Fusion Center in Texas conducted analysis, which ultimately led to the disruption of an active plot to target a law enforcement facility by an anti-government militia group. There has, in most of the major disruptions you read about in the news, there has been a role that's been played by the Fusion Center, which works in most areas of the country in a very complementary fashion with the JTTFs. So, I mean, there are multiple examples where the analytic work, the access to local, native, local, statewide information repositories have provided an asset to federal authorities as they've sought to work collectively to detect and disrupt these types of plots.
In some cases, the Fusion Center has to beat down the door of some of our federal partners. I'll use the San Francisco incident where they disrupted the gentleman who wanted to blow up the Bank of America and Federal Reserve. Was started with a suspicious activity report from the Fusion Center.
Well, I think welcome Chairman McCall here, and I think we'll wrap up the panel and thank our panelists for a great discussion, and looking forward to part 2 of this event. So, thanks.
If we could all please find our seats, we want to be respectful of the chairman's time. Thank you. Building on the session earlier this morning where we heard from the front lines and we heard from some of the state and local Fusion Center directors, and both from the production side and from the customer side, the consumers and users, thought it's only appropriate to now feed into the broader oversight function and role. I have the privilege of welcoming back Chairman Michael McCall to George Washington University. He has been a tireless champion for Homeland Security issues, counterterrorism issues, and law enforcement issues for a number of years, long before he was elected to Congress. He is serving in his 5th term, if I'm not mistaken, and was tapped to become chairman of the House Homeland Committee in 2013. Prior to being elected to Congress, though, he has an incredible background from a law enforcement perspective. He was chief of the Counterterrorism and National Security at the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Western District of Texas, the fine state of Texas, where he represents the 10th District. And in that capacity, he oversaw the Joint Terrorism Task Force, better known as the JTTFs. Prior to that, he also served as Deputy Attorney General of Texas, and was a federal prosecutor in the Department of Justice's Public Integrity section here in D.C. He's been a tireless advocate on a whole host of significant issues, ranging from border security, where I think he has definitely raised the bar and elevated the importance and significance around these issues. He's been a tireless advocate on counterterrorism issues. I've had the privilege of being on the other side, taking questions from from him as chairman on a few occasions, and can tell you that his work there has been yeoman's work. It's been incredible. He has also been a huge champion long before it became the flavor du jour on cybersecurity issues. He co-chaired a CSIS study that I think drove the agenda for the incoming, at that point, President-elect Obama to prioritize cybersecurity issues. He's passed legislation, which is very a rarity these days, given not a whole lot of legislation moves, but he has been successful on the cyber side and will continue to be successful going forward. And most importantly, in terms of today's discussion, he also oversaw an investigation that started under the chairmanship of Peter King, but followed up under Chairman McCall on the fusion centers. It was a robust investigation, and he's going to share some of the findings. It was released in July. And Mr. Chairman, the floor is yours, and thank you for joining us again.
Right. Thank you. Well, thank you, Frank. Frank is an Auburn fan, and he was giving me a hard time about the football game last Saturday against A&M, where Texas A&M actually lost. But we won't talk about that a whole lot. When I first got this chairmanship, I went to New York.
Football is undefeated. We don't have a team. So.
That's all right. So when I first got this chairmanship, I went up to New York because I thought it was important that I, express my concern, and New York is always going to be the top threat in the nation. And I had dinner with Ray Kelly, who I know was up for possible nomination for the secretary. I didn't get it, but a great guy. And we were having dinner, and he said, "Tell me about your family." I said, "Well, I got 5 kids. I got teenage daughters and triplets. They're 12 years old." And usually they ask me about the triplets, but he said teenage daughters. He said, "I got a couple of those." And so there's a difference between a teenage daughter and a terrorist. I said, "No, sir." And he said, "Well, you can negotiate with the terrorist." And that kind of sums up my life right now. The McCall House is very busy, and a lot of Homeland Security issues as well. I usually don't give prepared remarks, but this is kind of really, it's very detailed and kind of in the weeds, and I just want to kind of give these prepared remarks. But I do want to thank Frank and the Christian Beckner and the Homeland Security Policy Institute for inviting me to speak on this important issue. With 7 of the 78 fusion centers in my home state of Texas, including 2 in Austin, I've had the opportunity to learn about the great work being done within my state and across the nation. Fusion center structure and maturity varies widely across the country, and I've come to believe that fusion centers are important assets that serve not just local communities but the nation as a whole. And before I discuss the fusion center specifically, though, I'd like to take a step back and talk about information sharing more broadly. Information sharing is one of several interdependent pillars of national security. We can have the most sophisticated technology that money can buy. We can and do have the best agents and analysts in the entire world serving in our intelligence community. We can collect all the information necessary to detect a threat, but if the information isn't shared and the pieces aren't put together and action is not taken, this pretty much amounts to nothing. As chairman of the Homeland Security Committee, the horrifying truth of what can happen when information isn't shared is constantly in the forefront of my mind. The terrible events of September the 11th, where nearly 3,000 people lost their lives, is a prime example. The 2009 attack at Fort Hood, where Nidal Hassan, who was reportedly in contact with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula's Anwar al-Awlaki, opened fire, killing 13 people in my home state. And as we've seen in Boston recently, where the tragedy may have been prevented if the FBI had coordinated better with the Boston police. In these cases, information was available, but not shared, and tragically history unfolded. In its report, the 9/11 Commission said the biggest impediment to all source analysis to a greater likelihood of connecting the data is a human resistance to sharing information. It's kind of a cultural thing that we've seen, particularly in the FBI. And I believe that's true. We've seen historic change and unprecedented sharing over the last 12 years. But this is a battle that we continue to fight amongst ourselves. The 9/11 Commission recommended the establishment of a government-wide trusted information network. That network must include robust partnerships across all levels of government. And the program manager for the information sharing environment, Mr. Paul, I think appropriately refers to an information stewardship model of sharing, where information is treated as a national asset rather than owned by hoarding by the individual agency that collected it. My wife was an intelligence analyst at the Naval Intelligence and the CIA, and she said, you know, information's power. And because it is power, there's a reluctance to share it. And I think that still, unfortunately, is still true today. Far too often I hear stories of agencies withholding information from one another. And far too often I hear that information isn't flowing freely between all levels of government. Far too often I hear that the information and expertise in the state and local fusion centers isn't being fully utilized. In 2001, the terrorist threat to our homeland came primarily outside of our borders and was generally centralized with Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. On a sunny morning in September, Al-Qaeda operatives plotted and trained overseas, came into our country, conducted the worst terrorist attack in American history. The greatest arsenal against this continuing threat is the United States intelligence community. Today, however, while the overseas threat not only continues but has diversified among many Al-Qaeda affiliates, we now face a significant threat from within the homeland. This threat comes from individuals often acting alone, inspired by Al-Qaeda, radicalized by violent jihadist philosophy, radicalizing online, and capable of plotting and carrying out their deadly attacks in our cities and towns. As we were tragically reminded through the Boston bombings, this threat is all too real. Two brothers, Dzhokhar and Tamerlan Tsarnaev, immigrated to the United States as youth, attended U.S. schools, walked the streets of American towns and neighborhoods, plotted, built their bombs, and conducted an attack earlier this year that killed and injured hundreds. The Boston Police Commissioner, Ed Davis, testified before my committee that he was unaware that the FBI had previously investigated Tamerlan on a tip from the Russians that he may be associated with terrorists. I met with the Boston PD's Boston Regional Intelligence Center, or the BRIC, and they too had been unaware prior to the bombings. We may never know whether history could have been changed if the BRIC had been involved. But that's just the point. Sometimes it's impossible to know what a partner can bring to an investigation unless the information is shared and they have the opportunity to participate in the process. And I believe this is especially true when it comes to state and local participation in homeland security and counterterrorism in particular. FBI agents rotate in and out of the field offices, moving on to the next assignment, the next promotion. The same is true of other federal law enforcement agents and officers. And while they develop exceptional expertise, the simple fact is that the federal government will never know hometowns and neighborhoods and the streets as well as the locals do. Local police, fire, and other emergency responders understand the nuances of their jurisdiction, the streets and businesses, the people, the personalities, and the politics, in a way that only time and roots can fully develop. State and local law enforcement, analysts, and first responders must be robust and equal partners in securing the homeland from ever-evolving threats. Fusion centers are, in my judgment, the key to enhancing and further developing this vital partnership. That's why my committee continues to conduct oversight of federal support to fusion centers and recently released a comprehensive report following an extensive study of the national network. Megan Peterlin on my staff was the principal author of that report and did a fantastic job, I think, reaching out to fusion centers really across the nation. And when we talk about fusion centers and their role in homeland security, I think it's important that we all understand that first, fusion centers are owned and operated by the states and urban areas. DHS provides funding through the Homeland Security Grant Program, and I believe Congress has a role to play in helping these centers mature through oversight of federal support. But it's the states and the urban areas that own these centers. As a result, they have an obligation to not only serve the national missions, but their state and local mission needs. I believe that if done strategically, it's actually through the state and local missions that the fusion centers serve the national mission. Second, it's important to note that fusion centers are intended to produce analysis. They might support investigations, but as fusion centers, they are not investigative organizations. This matters greatly when we do talk about the relationship between the fusion centers and the Joint Terrorism Task Forces. There should be a synergy between the fusion centers and the JTTF, and they must work together and support each other, but they are not the same, and one does not and cannot take the place of the other. Since those points are so often misunderstood, I want to highlight them before I go on. So with that, I'd like to outline a few key challenges that I see for fusion centers and the national network as they continue to mature. The first is strategic planning. One of the greatest challenges the national network faces today is the lack of a comprehensive strategic plan. I think sometimes that phrase gets brushed off as a buzzword, and we forget that it really is necessary to develop healthy organizations and complex partnerships. I constantly hear critics argue that there are too many fusion centers, that the federal government isn't getting adequate return on its investment. But the truth is the state and locals decide the number of fusion centers, and great strides have been made in measuring fusion center capability. And as for the return on the investment, however, measuring the value of an ounce of prevention is extremely difficult. Nevertheless, we need to do so, and that measure must be grounded in strategic planning. We don't have a handle on long-term goals and objectives for the national network, or what the stakeholders expect from the federal, state, and local partnership. Should the federal government continue to divide its investment across 78 fusion centers through the grant process? Would the homeland be more secure if the federal government focused its investment towards fewer fusion centers, making them individually more well-funded and supported? If so, how many fusion centers do we need to protect the homeland? I don't really have the answers to all those questions. But in this tough fiscal environment, federal support must be targeted to achieve the desired defined outcome. There are questions that need answers, and these are the questions, and the first step towards answering them is to create a comprehensive strategic plan. As fusion centers continue to find their niche in homeland security, their evolving mission space does pose a challenge. In the early days, counterterrorism was the declared fusion center mission centerpiece. Today, the vast majority of fusion centers consider themselves all crimes or all crimes, all hazard centers. Fusion centers contribute to analysis on prison radicalization, human smuggling, drug trafficking, gang identity theft, transnational criminal organizations, an array of local issues. In my home state of Texas and elsewhere, there's incredible work being done in the fusion centers to enhance border security. Effectively growing into an all crimes, all hazards mission requires increased partnerships, particularly with emergency response agencies outside of local law enforcement. It's important to understand that if prevention and response organizations aren't communicating and coordinating, the nation's preparedness and response efforts suffer. And while I applaud the centers that have proactively incorporated the whole emergency response community, some fusion centers still generally lack an understanding of how these organizations come together to better serve the communities. As the national network continues to mature, analytic collaboration and preparedness, response planning should be enhanced between the prevention and response communities. We're also starting to see many fusion centers adding cybersecurity, as Frank mentioned, to their mission to help address these threats to our critical infrastructures. The federal government must do a better job coordinating with not only fusion centers, but all state and local cyber efforts. In particular, we need to understand how fusion centers do and can play a role in cybersecurity and assist in maturing these efforts in a coordinated fashion. In 2003, a contingent of northeastern states established the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center, or the MSISAC. Serving an operational function, it is the primary vehicle by which the federal government shares cyber-related information with the states. This includes best practices, security advisories, malware analysis, forensics, code analysis, and mitigation recommendations in the event of a cyber attack. However, fusion centers could play a larger role in working with the state and local governments to better coordinate cybersecurity policy planning, communication, emergency response, and recovery, similar to a sector coordinating council as outlined in the National Infrastructure Protection Plan. My committee will be working with DHS, looking into how enhanced Fusion Center cybersecurity capabilities could increase coordination with cyber incident response efforts. Another challenge I see is training and workforce development. No different than our need to develop the intelligence community workforce, we must continue our efforts to improve the expertise of state and local analysts. DHS provides analytic training, but fiscal and logistical realities do limit its availability. Not to mention that some of the mature centers are ready for more advanced training that just isn't widely available to them. Building a comprehensive Homeland Security analytic architecture requires that analysts across all levels share a common language, and the federal government must lead the efforts to establish that language. That said, training is only one part of developing the Fusion Center workforce. Career tracks that encourage analytic expertise, encourage state and local analyst retention, and grow Fusion Center leaders can only be established at the state and local level. The national network has seen approximately 50 new Fusion Center directors within the last 18 months, due in large part to standard rotation within agencies. This causes a strain on the young system and can temporarily slow national network development. Although we've come a long way, security clearances and access to classified information continues to challenge the national network and inhibit information sharing. And I want to applaud DHS and DoD's efforts to improve access under the Homeland Security Data Network's whitelist and challenge them to continue these efforts. However, greater access to DoD and DHS information is simply not enough. Through my committee's investigation into the Boston bombings and our work with the Fusion Centers, we've identified a significant gap in state and locals' lack of interest to the FBI's classified Guardian system. Increased access among state and local Fusion Center personnel would, in my judgment, serve to greatly improve information sharing and the partnership between the FBI and state and local law enforcement. We found that access to this system is hit and miss across the country and simply not acceptable. On the issue of security clearances, we've come a long way, but we're still not where we should be. Higher level clearances are still inconsistent among Fusion Center directors, and I believe this makes our communities less safe. These directors must have a thorough awareness of threats that could impact their communities, and that can't happen if the FBI isn't able to share threat information due to classification restrictions. Similarly, the Memorandum of Understanding signed between the FBI and JTTF participating agencies expressly prohibits information sharing without the FBI's approval. This is an extremely important point when we look at the Boston case and what could have been done to prevent it. It's my understanding that negotiations are occurring within the FBI to adjust the terms of this MOU and that to be able to share with the police officers that are on the JTTF with the police chief himself. Ed Davis was completely unaware of Tamerlan, the investigation, and the Russian warning. But that change is only occurring as a result of these tragic bombings in Boston. Improvements to information sharing can't continue to be so entirely reactionary. The MOU was known to be dangerously restrictive long before the Boston bombings, yet the FBI continued to err on the side of holding information close rather than sharing it broadly with law enforcement partners. I've heard stories of threats even to Fusion Centers themselves that weren't shared with the Fusion Center personnel. It's been 12 years since 9/11, and yet we continue to see this pattern of withholding information. It simply can't continue. No single agency can do it all to protect the homeland. It must be a true partnership between the FBI, DHS, Fusion Centers, and others working together to share information, to identify threats, and take action. Switching gears, I've mentioned several times that my committee has conducted and is conducting an investigation into the Boston Marathon terrorist attack. It's relevant to this topic, and I want to take this opportunity to let you know that we are preparing to release a report with our findings and recommendations as early as the end of November. My committee will do its part to help oversee the necessary changes and strengthen Homeland Security. I began talking to you here today about information sharing gaps. One of the biggest takeaways from our investigation is just that. Tamerlan's travel to Russia should have raised red flags. It should have triggered greater scrutiny. And it may have if agencies had effectively shared that information. The Boston Police Commissioner, Ed Davis, should have been made aware of the tip from the Russians about this possible terrorist threat in his hometown of Boston. Massachusetts' 2 fusion centers should have been made aware of Tamerlan and the Russian warning. They should have had the opportunity to search their records and keep an eye on the situation, but that never happened. Homeland Security is a national responsibility. Even the American people themselves are asked, if you see something, say something, and fusion centers are a real vital part of that enterprise, and in many cases have already developed this expertise. We've had a number of high-profile incidents right here in Washington in the past couple of months. The shooting at the Navy Yard, the tragic events of just a few weeks ago when a woman suffering from mental illness raced her car first towards the White House and then towards the Capitol. When these incidents occur, fusion centers across the country immediately go into action, pulling any and all information they can from state and local databases to help identify the individuals involved and share information with each other. And through this national network, other major cities immediately had situational awareness, helping them assess that these were isolated events that did not require additional law enforcement presence in their own streets. That was an important event. I think when that event happened, the first question I had and many people in law enforcement was, is this a potential terrorist attack? Who is this individual? Are there other individuals out there? Those are the first questions we have to ask. And the way the Fusion Center kicked into gear, sharing all this information, we were very readily able to assess that this was an isolated threat, that it didn't pose a greater threat to members of Congress, to the president, and that it was not a terrorist threat. And I think the Fusion Center did a phenomenal job in that effort. So when there are those out there, the critics who say we need to do away with fusion centers, I talk about Boston. You know, that's precisely why we need the fusion centers. That's why we need a partnership with state and locals, a force multiplier, if you will, Boston Police working with the FBI. And I point out the most recent events of the Navy Yard and then the woman racing in the car, how the fusion centers came together. Fusion centers are still maturing, but their value is tremendous. And I just want to personally, before we go into Q&A, personally thank all of you for the roles that you play at the state and local level with the fusion centers. And know that you have a chairman of the Homeland Security Committee that's an advocate, that's a champion for you, because I believe in these fusion centers, and I've seen the great work they have produced and the great results that they have brought forward to help protect American lives. So with that, thank you so much for having me, and Frank, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for a very, very comprehensive remarks, and I hope it's okay. You'll join us for a few questions. I think your sobering and newsworthy message in terms of the FBI and Boston PD does underscore the significance in terms of information sharing. And I think also a point of clarity that people get lost is that the Joint Terrorism Task Forces are focused on cases and investigations. The day-to-day steady state is where the fusion centers can play a very significant role, not from an investigatory standpoint alone, but to be able to provide good intelligence and information to provide situational awareness. And I think that gets lost in all the discussions and conversations. But one of the things I'd be curious is we are in a tough fiscal environment. We're going to have to do more with less. And you, I think, appropriately raised the question, do we take the peanut butter approach and everyone spread it out, everyone gets the same amount, or do we find a way to regionalize or to better build on some of those most robust fusion centers? I mean, looking forward, looking to the budget environment, and I know you were also suggesting we need to assess that, but if you had to sort of jump out a little bit, where do you see it going 2 to 3 years from now?
Well, I personally don't want to see a cut in the budget
At all.
for the federal grants for the fusion centers because of the important role that they play. I think this environment, we have to be leaner and smarter. The fusion centers vary. I mean, I know the one in Austin works really well, but then there are critics who say, but these other ones don't. I think they have to come up to speed to justify their what they're doing. But you're right; they're more of an analytical entity, not an investigative. So when I just talk about the role between the JTTS and the fusion centers, that's kind of the distinction.
And we need both,
And
right?
you need both. And I think you need a fusion center does analysis, and a JTTF. I've worked with the JTTFs in the FBI, and it's purely an investigative arm. But when you have an event happen and a crisis happen, you need the analytical capability to scrub, backgrounds, data, who are these individuals, and that analysis comes out of the fusion centers, which was very valuable. Again, with the recent woman driving the car in Washington, unfortunately, it wasn't tapped into in Boston.
Yeah.
And I think anytime, particularly if you have a foreign country, threat warnings from foreign countries regarding potential terrorists is not a common event. It's a more extraordinary event, and I don't think it was taken as seriously as it should have been. And it certainly should have been shared with the local police, who are really the eyes and ears. They know the streets, they know the people, and so do the fusion centers. The brick in Boston or Massachusetts
Correct.
certainly should have been tapped into to scrub this individual for any information they had. And the real tragedy in Boston, in my view, is that certain things happen and mistakes were made. I can be a big fan of the FBI, but if they make a mistake, I think it's imperative that we learn lessons from those mistakes to not repeat those mistakes. And the fact is, they did open an investigation on him. The fact is that a custom flag went up on the text system. He was put on the Tide by the CIA. And the fact is, he did leave the country. He fulfilled exactly what the Russians warned us he would do. He left to go to the Chechen region, the Caucasus, where the Chechen rebels are, extreme radical Islamists. He did get radicalized over there. He met up with his boxing buddy, Plotnikov. Nadal was a recruiter over there. He didn't learn how to make pressure cooker bombs,
On the internet.
on the internet. That's a very sophisticated tradecraft that actually comes out of the Taliban in Pakistan. Interestingly, when I went down the streets of Boston with the police chief and saw where the pressure cookers went off, the 8-year-old boy next to one of these pressure cookers, the Tamerlan, just a monster. And then the Watertown police, 3 police officers that were heroic. They'd never seen a gunfight in their career. And suddenly they got the 2 biggest terrorists since 9/11 stumbling into their neighborhood, into their beat. A firefight ensued. Tamerlan was a great shot. He hit police officers right in the chest multiple times, but they had their vest on. He started to throw pipe bombs at the police. When I went to the scene just months after, there were still bullet holes in the fences and windows, windshields busted out. They shot Tamerlan 8 times. He was dragged by his brother about 10, 15 feet by the car. Tamerlan's still fighting. He's been shot 8 times and dragged 15 feet by a car. To show you what a monster he was, they handcuffed him and threw him in the ambulance. But everything in his head is gone. We don't have that in intelligence. But the fact is, when the custom flag went up, there should be an automatic notification to the FBI, the case agents, and frankly, the local police should have been involved, to warn them, hey, this guy just left the country. He's fulfilling what the Russians warned us. And certainly, by the time he comes back, because of the way the system was at the time, his name is taken off the permanent list, which would have put him through secondary screening coming back into the country, which who knows what that would have revealed. The Tide, unfortunately, they put his name in incorrectly spelled, wrong birth date, and they didn't have an algorithm like they have today, like a Google search that would catch that. But the point is, when he came back in, if we'd known that, just maybe we could have taken a second look at him. And the thing that I hear that I think is most offensive to me is, Mr. Chairman, it wouldn't have made a difference because our case was closed. Well, maybe it should have made a difference. To know that he traveled and did exactly what the Russians said to meet up with extremists, with militants, coming back into the United States, just maybe they should have taken a second look at him. If they had, what they would have found was these YouTube websites, these radical jihadist websites. If they had talked to the community, if they talked to his imam in the mosque who said he radicalized. Now, I know hindsight's 20/20. We got to be right every time. And I'm trying to be too hard about that, but there are lessons learned from that we can fix. And the BRIC not being involved in this at all, when they could have provided information about him, I think it's a real disappointment because there's a value of information and analysis that was not tapped into in the Boston case. So when the critics say they want to do away with fusion centers, I point to Boston, I point to the recent events here in Washington, and why it is so important. And then in my home state, I mean, our local colonel is a huge fan because of the work they've done with respect to border security, with respect to who is coming into the country across the Texas-Mexico border. We've had several apprehensions of Pakistanis coming across that are of concern. And so the fusion centers play a tremendous role in those efforts. And I think cybersecurity is going to be, again, this new enhanced mission that I think the fusion centers will be involved in.
And I want to build on that point. Firstly, radar screen to put out there, not that it needs it, but with the Sochi Olympics and all that you're seeing with the Caucasus Emirate and Doku Umarov rearing his head, I think there are, and the fact that you have literally thousands of Chechen foreign fighters in Syria that are going to return to Russia, that's a screaming headline, blinking red kind of concern. But to move to cyber specifically, and Austin, I mean, you're at the heart of much of the cyber entrepreneurialism, both from a corporate standpoint, from a university perspective. We did a major survey of the fusion centers and of the major Metro Intel chiefs, and they all recognized and acknowledged the need for cyber analysis. They also recognize that they don't have the analytical capability to do that right now. I would argue, though, is there a chance to get to public-private partnerships here? Because in addition to state and local, maybe this is a way we can work around some of the cyber challenges we're looking at and get to, we can't do this inside the bubble of government alone. Maybe Austin could be the place where you can initiate some of that public-private partnerships in terms of information sharing. Keeping privacy issues obviously into consideration.
Yeah, I can't overemphasize the amount of damage Snowden did. CISPA, I had the amendment to CISPA to establish the civilian interface and not just the military interface. The role of DHS is a civilian interface to the private sector and to the critical infrastructures. The NCIC has had some growing pains, but its capability is increasing, and it's designed to share cyber signature threat information with the private sector and the critical infrastructures. That's federal, state, private sector. What's missing right now is that the private sector is not incentivized, and 90% of this threat information is in the private sector, because 90% of the infrastructures are controlled by the private sector. Everybody thinks the NSA has all the threat information. They've got a little piece of this foreign intelligence threat information. DHS has a piece, FBI, but the majority of it's in the private sector. We don't have access to a lot of that because we don't have a full partnership with the private sector. And we can't do that. The executive order can't, there's one thing it can't do, and that's provide liability protections for the sharing of that information. So without that, you have no incentive to share that information. And not only can they not share it with the federal government, but they can't share across sector lines. So we have the 16 sectors, ISACs out there that can't even share amongst themselves because of this liability concern. Our bill would put the 16 ISACs on the floor of the NCIC with liability protections so they can share not only back and forth federal government to private sector, but also amongst sector lines, the 16 sectors. I think that would go a long ways in protecting what I see as a growing threat. We talk about the Syria. I mean, there's a lot to be concerned with there, and the training and recruiting, and of course Chechen rebels are there, but so is Al Qaeda, not to mention Hezbollah.
And a lot of West.
It's all culminating in Syria, this Sunni Shia conflict and the Arab-Iran, relationship or lack thereof, hatred. But when I look at the cyber threat, when Iran hits Aramco in the Saudi Peninsula and knocks out 30,000 hard drives, and then simultaneously hits the financial institutions in the United States, which are under attack on a weekly basis, they just can't talk about it because of the liability issues. But they're getting hit by Iran and constantly.
Yep.
And there are other nation states out there that are preparing these kind of attacks. And the top military command will tell you this is one of their biggest fears right now, because our offensive capability is extraordinary, and that capability turned against us. You have the theft of IP, you have espionage that China's engaged in, stealing our Pentagon blueprints. But the final threat of shutting things down is the one that really concerns me the most. Something that could provide a shutdown of the power grid in the Northeast. Something like Sandy on that scale, but a longer-term disaster. And Sandy was about a $60 to $80 billion disaster. A cyber attack could cause even greater damage. And so it's something that I'm really trying to work with DHS to upgrade their capability, but we also need to pass this bill to provide that liability protection that's so important.
I second that based on every conversation I've heard with the private sector. We have time for a couple of quick questions. Please identify yourself if you have a question. Chuck.
Chucky Witt, Lafayette, we provide the staff support for all of the chiefs of the big cities. Frank, thank you for today. Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to corroborate initially that you're absolutely correct about where the major cities are in their negotiations with the FBI. We are meeting with the new director this month, and we have transmitted to them a list of specific reforms and changes to be implemented in the MOUs for all of our 66 large cities, each of which to realize the objectives you have articulated today and based upon lessons learned from Boston. So you were spot on with every point, and we appreciate what you do.
Well, thank you. When I talked to, when I went up to Boston, I met with the FBI SAC, with Ed Davis, with the DHS officials, CBP, and Ed Davis just said, it was just embarrassing to me. More than anything, he said, I was just embarrassed that I didn't know about this guy and that he was on the radar screen and he fell off of it. And the fact is, you're right, without these MOUs, the police officers on the task force can't even share that with the police chief, which is really kind of crazy. And I think that's something I've been pushing the FBI to change. And I will tell you, Davis has said, look, since you started your hearings and investigation, it's changed a lot of things dramatically in terms of the FBI's sharing of information. I've been on the inside of this, and I know the mentality is, look, we're the counterterrorism experts. These local guys don't know, that we can't risk sharing this with them, and they're going to talk. And but the fact is, the state and locals can be a force multiplier. That, like I said, they know the streets. There are 12,000 FBI agents. There are 36,000 New York police officers. And they talk about the resource issue, but the state and locals can be a force multiplier. And so that's why the police chiefs, every one of them, sent a letter to me and the chairman of the Intel Committee saying, please support these fusion centers. And all 50 states, the colonels of the respective DPSs have sent letters of support. That's pretty strong politically. I would encourage everybody out there to continue that type of advocacy, because that's a pretty strong statement when you have every police chief and every member of Congress has their local police chiefs.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Congressman. We will be meeting with them and reporting back to you on our progress. Thus far, the Bureau has indicated their willingness to make all of the changes that we have requested in the MOU, and we'll advise you of our progress. And Art Azevedo asked me to say hello. Art Azevedo.
Okay, tell him I said hi too.
Andy?
And I'm glad to hear that, because this exercise I'm engaged in is not it's not so much about gotcha politics. It's what mistakes were made and what can we do to fix that in the future and better protect the American people. So,
Andy Robinson with ICF. I'm going to take it up a level. Congressman, we have some government workers here today and government contractors. Wondering if you can give us a view into the next 6 months of what happens in December, any legislation that might get passed in our near future. Thank you.
Are you talking with respect to the continuing resolution? And yeah,
that would be among them. Yes.
Yeah, I'm not chairman of the budget committee, so it's really not my area of expertise. But I don't want to punt the issue entirely. I was on a lot of these Sunday shows talking about Boston and Syria, and then this thing sucked the oxygen out of it's really sucked the oxygen out of all the other issues. That there are a lot of other important ones, but this is extremely important. I was at our conference sitting next to Paul Ryan. He's working with Patty Murray in the Senate. We've seen the select committee, super committee before. I don't know if they're going to be able to reach a compromise. I'd like to see a longer term solution, not deal with this problem every 2 months, because it's highly destructive. I wasn't a big fan of shutting the government down. I think it was a mistake. I think it frankly blew back on my party. And certainly defaulting on your debt is a very dangerous thing to be talking about. I do think if there's a way to, when I look at Homeland Security and you look at the budget, about a quarter of the budget is discretionary. And so that deals with the needs of the military, the intelligence community, FBI, what we're talking about here today, Homeland Security, national security issues that under sequestration are getting squeezed, really to the point where I think it's posing a national security issue for the nation. And it's sacrificed on the altar of mandatory entitlement spending. And we got to talk about, we have to be adults in the room and realize, what is this budget pie? What does it look like? When 3/4 of it is mandatory entitlement spending, it's not sustainable. And we just hit a $17 trillion debt. $17 trillion that we're going to hand down to our next generation, unless we can get a handle on this. We think we need to reform these programs to save them. We think the current path is really unsustainable. And the longer we fail to address that issue, the more we're going to continue to squeeze out this discretionary spending that, quite frankly, is going to hurt things like what we're talking about, fusion centers. It's going to hurt our national security interests. It's already damaging our military, which I think under the Constitution is our number one, providing for a common defense. So I think it's a very dangerous policy to go down this road and do nothing. If we do nothing to reform mandatory spending or deal with the issue, we're putting the nation at greater risk. And I think the president understands this. Frankly, I think all members of Congress understand this. They just don't have the political courage to take it on. And it has to be dealt with. And I would prefer a longer term solution that the speaker talks about often as a sort of grand bargain that deals with these longer term issues. But I don't have a crystal ball. I can tell you, I don't want to see us go into another government shutdown for a lot of reasons. It's bad policy, but it's also really bad politics, I think, for us. And so, and I think people kind of get that after what happened.
Mr. Chairman, on that sober and somber note, unfortunately the tyranny of time require I be a tyrant and cut us off here. I want to say thank you for your leadership. Thank you for joining us today, and you've got people who share your fulfilled mission in the long run, so thank you for that.
Thanks so much.